Hello everyone, this is Karamo, and this short video I want to share with you all how do we rename our variables using our programming software. Now let's assume that we are given a data frame, and we look at it. When we open this data frame, we found some variable names, and some of these variable names are really long to read, and some of them is very difficult to analyze them. So what we want to do is that we want to rename some of these variables to a variable name that is easy to read and can easy to understand. So that's the purpose of this video, to rename our variable names to names that is easy to read and easy to understand. So let's get started. So before we start, we are going to load the dataset that we'll be working with in this example. And this dataset is a Gapminder data. So when we load the data, we have data, and the data is in CSV file, so we have read.csv, and the name of our data frame is gapminder underscore data.csv. This is the name of the data frame, and the data set is loaded in our global environment as 1704 observations and 6 variables. But it's also worth knowing that the observation here also means number of rows we have in our data, and the variables here also mean the number of columns. So that means we have 6 columns and we have 1704 rows in our data set. So if we want to see this, what we're going to do, we can type view, and then we have our data. So now this gives us how our data set looks like. Now this is a data set that we are working with, the Gapminder data. It has 6 variables and 1704 rows. And these are the variables: country, continent, year, life expectancy, population, and GDP per capita. So what we're going to do is that we want to rename these 2 variables instead, because we have Afghanistan, but we also have Albania, we have Algeria, Angola, and many other countries here. And the continents, we have Asia, we have Africa, we have Europe, we have America, and many other continents too. So now instead of having it as country and continent, we want to rename them as countries and continents. So that's the purpose of this video, and I'm going to walk with you the easy method that we can use to rename these variables. So first, what we're going to do is that we have the first data frame as data. So we're going to create another data frame and we will rename it as data1. Data1. So what we're going to do now, we have a second data frame as data1, but before we rename this variable, we have to load a package or library called dplyr, and dplyr package, because the rename function that we're going to use have to come from this package. So before you rename your variable first, you have to load this package first, because the function we will be using have to come from this library. So we have to load this library first. Now when you load the library, then you can now go ahead and rename some of the variable names you want to have from the original data. Now what we're going to do here is that we want to see the rows first before we continue our rename. So names of our variables, we have them here: country, continent, and so on. Now we want to rename these as countries and continents. So what we're going to do is that we have the data frame, and then we bring in the old data frame that we want to rename variables from. So data, and we bring in the pipe operator, percentage greater than percentage. This means that we're going to pipe whatever we have in the left hand side of the code to the right hand side of code. And in most instances, people read this as and then. For example, if we have our data set, then what do we want to do? So we have our data, and then what do we want to do? We want to rename. And what do we want to rename? We want to rename some variables that we have inside this data frame, which is this one. This is what we want to rename. And when we look at the names we have in this data frame, we have country and we also have continent. So these are the 2 variables that we want to rename. So the pipe operator here means whatever we have in the left side of the code, that is this data, we're going to pipe this data to what we're going to have in the second part of the code, that is the data. And then we want to rename. What do we want to rename? These 2 variables that we have inside this data frame. So rename what? So in rename also we have to understand one thing. When we want to rename something using the dplyr, the new name have to come first before the old name, and they all have to be in quotations. Now the new name that we wanted to have is countries, and we want to rename this to country. And then the other one is continents. We want to rename this to continent. Now we have countries. That's this one. This is what we want to rename from country to countries. And this is continent, from continent to continents. And all these changes are going to be made in the second data frame called data 1. The original data is data, so no changes is going to happen in this one. So the second data frame we created is going to have the effects in it. So we will see when the effects already take place. So when we run this line of code now, and good, there is no error. So we have data and we also have data 1. They all have 6 variables and the same number of observations. This is because the rows are not affected. It's just the variable names. Now when we also check in the names we have in our second data frame, that is data 1, we will now realize that some of the variable names changes. Now in data 1 we have countries and continents, but in the first data we have country and continent. That means the line of code that we draw to rename our variables is already to take effect in some of our column names like countries and continents. So this is all I want to show you in this short demonstration, and I thank you all for listening and thank you all for your time again.